So at least here we've had a big change in our weather. It appears our drought is ending, and by next week we're going to be down to normal temperatures, which means we might start getting some snow. I guess we do have some snow in the forecast. So that feels more normal to me. Which I think is a good segue into what I want to talk about this morning. Um, this arose out of someone's Dyson this week, where we got talking about the nature of attachment. And what is attachment, and how do we know when we're attached? And I think that's a wonderful question. And I'll also talk about delusion because that's the close associate of attachment. And that, as Zen Buddhists, we're supposed to be shedding our attachments and our delusions. So, what are our attachments? It's one of those things like, okay, yeah, we know what attachments are. But the more that I've probed into it, the less that I think that I do know. So, at one level, maybe the most superficial level, we might say that attachments are like addictions or similar to addictions, right? So just as a person who's using drugs is upset, well, they crave the drug, right? And they get upset if they don't have it. And certainly attachments can behave in that way. But there's some fine and subtle distinctions. For example, if about 11 o'clock you start thinking, boy, I really like to have lunch when this is over, I'm hungry, is that an attachment? Are you attached to lunch? Are you attached to eating? And the answer is don't know. It could be, it could not be. If you get that little rumble in your tummy and say, boy, I'm looking forward to lunch, and then you're back paying attention to Peter's talk because it's absolutely fascinating, then chances are that's not an attachment. Just a fleeting desire, perhaps might be the right word. And sort of an appropriate and necessary one, right? Hunger is part of our survival. Thirst is part of our survival. These things are important. So where do we end the realm of attachment? Where does it become a problem? We might introduce the term obsession. I might say if I'm thinking about it obsessively, if I can't get it out of my head, whatever the desire or the want or the possession is that attachment? Well, it might be. It might very well be. So it's important that we look at this and how do we make this distinction and how do we frame up those things in our lives that we need to change because they are attachments and those things which are simply normal, fleeting human desires that are not obstacles in our lives or in our practice. So there's another way we could look at it. We could say, okay, we could attachments cause us some degree of pain and suffering. If I have a nice new car and I'm not attached to it and it gets a scratch, I may have a momentary like, oh crap, now, now it's not new anymore. It's got a scratch. End of it. But if I'm attached, then I might go on for hours, like, that SOB who scratched my car, like that. And you may even have had encounters like that. I certainly have been in a parking lot where I opened my door and I touched the car next to me, and that person was yelling at me, you know, which would suggest to me that they were more than usually fond of their vehicle. Dido used had a little thing where he said, having a Mercedes is not a problem. Having an attachment to having a Mercedes is having the problem. But what a fine line, what a fine distinction. Probably nobody goes out and buys a Mercedes. It's like, oh, just another car. I think I'm going to spend $80,000 on. I don't know what a Mercedes costs now. That's probably the ballpark. You know, they're going for that. They're spending a lot of money on that specific vehicle for a specific reason. Now, if that reason is because it has a better highway safety rating, or because it lasts 5 years longer than the average vehicle, something like that, would you say that's attachment? I wouldn't. But if it's because, like, oh, it's a wonderful car and I'm going to look great in it, and those kinds of things, okay, now we're getting into the realm of attachment. And again, look at, if this car gets scratched, that's a really good test, right? Don't go out and scratch your cars to do this, but scratches happen, things happen, life happens, branches fall from trees, all sorts of things happen. And if we're not attached, we're not, we may have a momentarily, oh crap, and then we move right on. If it sticks with us, it's attachment. So this requires a bit of refinement, a bit of discernment, right? To kind of know. There are myriads of examples. If you like to have a drink alcoholic drink when you come home from work at night to help relax, is that attachment? Well, we don't know until the day you come home and the bottle's empty, right? And if at that point it's like you're upset, you're angry, you're frustrated, whatever it is, whoa, you might want to look at your use of that drink, because it's now more than just a little bit of social relaxation. It seems to have some more import, and that's the attachment. But again, I think the simplest test is it causing us discomfort or suffering? Yeah, back to that example of the drink. If you just don't have the drink and you're not discomforted or suffering, yeah, right. But if it ruins your evening because you haven't had that drink, then again, need to look at that. Look at that. Is that an attachment? Our possession. There's a wonderful little story going on right now. I think it's great. Um, Ironic, because it's a kind of a clash of two cultures. There's a place in I guess it's Nevada, called Thacker Pass. Maybe you may or may not have heard it. But there's a Canadian company that wants to mine lithium on the property of the Northern Paiute tribe, whose land it is. And the Northern Paiutes have raised as much resistance as they can to this, because what they want to mine are some sacred mountains that belong to the tribe and so on. But this great irony that has risen out of this, I'm reading about. There's a 66-year-old tribal elder, healer, sort of holy man, and who's wheelchair bound. He's had a foot amputated. I'm guessing maybe he has diabetes. I don't know. And so you've got this 66-year-old elder who lives on almost nothing, has nothing. And the lithium mining company, is a Canadian company, is suing him. And I just think that's so ironic, because this man, A, has no possessions to speak of. B, he has no attachment to possessions. And C, he is connected to all of nature, the sky and the land, and so on and so forth. So what did he do when he got the lawsuit? He was having a sweat lodge that day, and he threw the papers into the fire. But so there's a man who has few or no attachments, certainly to material possessions. He doesn't have material possessions, right? But many of us do. We do, and that makes it makes it more complicated, right? In a certain sense, it's almost easier. The the Zen ancestors that we read about had nothing, or virtually nothing, and prior to that, in India, the ancestors had nothing but a robe and a bowl. That was their entire possessions. And yet it's possible to attach even to that. So it's not necessarily related to quantity. It's not, it's kind of the psychological importance that we attach to the thing. So who can tell you when you're attaching? The answer is you. You're really the only one who can tell. I can't tell. I mean, if you give me enough information, I can probably figure it out. But that said, by and large, that's something that only you can discern, especially when you get into the sort of subtler differences. If you're absolutely addicted to something, it's clear. When you don't have that something, you suffer. It's clear. But as we step back from that, it becomes far more subtle and difficult to discern. And there also might be a criteria that says, so what? If we have an attachment and it isn't harmful, is it okay? We probably all have myriads of attachments that are, let's call them minor or insignificant. They don't matter much. So unless we're investing in some type of purity, which I hope that we aren't, so what? But when they cause us suffering, when they interfere with our lives, when they interfere with our relationships with other people, so on and so forth, now they have become significant. Let's flip over now to delusions. The other thing that we're supposed to get rid of. And delusions don't mean liking Robert Kennedy Jr. on the internet. Almost all of our thoughts are delusions because the fundamental delusion is separation. The fundamental delusion is every time that we look at our lives and the world and we don't see that it is one body, that everything is deeply, intimately connected. The minute we create separation, the minute there's you and me, the minute there's yours and mine, all of those things, those are delusive from a Buddhist perspective. Now, the only way that we can completely shed those delusions would be to live constantly in the absolute. As soon as we step into the relative, which of course is where we live almost all the time, there is separation, there is delusion. There's you and me. There's yours and mine. I can't walk into your house and say, hey, that separation is a delusion. These are my properties too, and walk out with them, right? You'd probably be upset. Um, so, so we here again, from the perspective of delusion, we are constantly deluding ourselves. Other than maybe when we're in a state of samadhi or when we're in a kensho kind of an experience where there is no separation. There's no me and you. There's no, um, yours and mine, and so on and so forth. But that's not where we live. That's not what what we contend with. And our thinking is constantly based on those separations. So, in a sense, almost all of our thinking is delusive. So, one remedy would be to stop thinking. Now, some people try that. It's kind of difficult, to be honest. If you've tried it, you may have found that out. And yet, so it's something that we work on in Zazen, right? We're trying, not necessarily to stop thinking, but not to be attached to our thoughts. Oh, so here's where attachment comes in relative to delusion. Because if there's a delusive thought that arises and we're not attached to it, it may not matter. It may not add to our suffering or to the suffering of somebody else. It's something that comes and goes. Right? When things just come and go, they don't tend to do very much damage. I just heard from a friend that I hadn't heard from in a very long time. I heard from him in the last couple of days. And back in August, his house burned down. Now, that was a lesson about attachment and delusion that he did not need. he did not want. But sometimes it takes something catastrophic like that to make us wake up to how bound up we are with our delusive thoughts and our attachments. And yet, some of it, if what burned in the house were the pictures of his ancestors, of his parents and grandparents, and he was upset about that. Should we say, oh, that's a terrible attachment. You shouldn't care about your ancestors, your relations. I think most of us would be pretty upset if that happens, right? Is it attachment? Yes. Is it delusion? Yes. Is it bad? I would say not, unless it reached a certain point. Okay, now you're so depressed and you can't get through the day because you lost those photos. Ups. Now we're in a different kind of part of the country, and now you're suffering. So perhaps, sort of in closing on this topic, we might want to yet use that suffering as the criteria. If we have an attachment or a delusion and it's not causing us or someone else to suffer, maybe it's benign and it doesn't matter. But at the point that we or someone else starts to suffer, then it's something that we need to work on. It's something that we need to change. Final note being that with this and with all things, we need to guard against purity. I don't believe that to live life compassionately, empathetically, as bodhisattvas, we need to have zero attachments and delusions. We don't need to be Shanti Deva. So again, that's a personal discernment for each of us. Given the fact that we're never going to be perfect. When are we good enough? When are we unattached enough? When are we undiluted enough? Again, I can't answer that question for you. I can barely answer it for me. I'm in great flux about it. So it's not even there's any constancy in my answers. But it requires discernment on all of our parts. We keep coming back to this place that Zen is not easy. It requires that we pay attention, that we're aware of our thoughts, that we're aware of our actions, that we're aware of our cravings and our desires, and so on. And that we run those through a sort of filter that says, is this something benign, okay, not terribly important, or is this a place that I need to make change, that I need to let go? A constant process with no simple answers. I'm going to pause there, see what you folks are thinking.
Peter, if I may, I I wrestle with this particular question a great deal. Um, uh, I've always been intrigued by the Stoics, Stoic philosophy, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, Epictetus, and oftentimes, and I read. Uh, uh, well, I'll say this as Susan knows, a a daily book on the Stoic thinking, so it's present in my mind. And at the same time, I also read something about Zen, so that precedes meditation. So I find a great deal of crossover in the two, and it's confusing to me constantly. Um, how far attachment goes, and what is the balance. And I really appreciate your bringing this up because it's helpful to me, particularly just the hmm, must be a way of saying this, healthy analysis ongoing of what's happening to me and attachments. This morning, I read that one of those three, and I don't remember which one, said you should treat, first of all, Stoicism, particularly Epictetus' Stoicism, is too radical for me. It shoves everything away, and so it seems to me, and so consequently, you wind up not suffering on the front end because you have no attachments whatsoever. But on the back end, what I find is that you have to make room for joy. Joy can come from attachments, and it's healthy. And the problem I find with some stoicism, as you have pointed out, it gets so radical that nope, can't have joy because man, you get attached to that and you're hooked. Well, then where are we? So but one of them said that he treats all things that have even the slightest attachment as glass, and consequently looks at them as though they are always about to break. And so consequently, he's simply aware. Well, um, uh, so is the answer then that we in our training and our philosophical thinking um, uh, just free when we can be attached and be trained enough to let go and to say, well, there goes, there goes my marriage, my house, my photographs of my ancestors, my family. Um, Good training, things are impermanent, and it really does catch you on the cusp of idealism versus a more healthy, I think, balance. In any event, all of this is really right to what I've been struggling with for a long time, and it's an appreciated topic. And so, thank you.
Thank you, Cal. Well, it it is something that I think invites struggling. You know, it's again, it's complex, it's subtle, it's constantly shifting. And on one hand, we don't want to sink into, I don't know what it would be, sort of indolence and hedonism or something like that. And on the other hand, we don't want to be super pure Luddites, or again, I don't kind of don't have the right adjectives for the contrast, but you know, you use the word balance. I think that's what we're looking for to a great extent. Is how do we use shedding our attachments and delusions to help us stay in a place of balance? And balance is so important. I mean, when we have to deal with families, when we have to deal with life partners, when we have to deal with our work situations, all of these places, we cannot be in a place of purity, right? We have to be in a place of balance. We have to make compromises, right? If we're living in relationship, compromise is essential. And sometimes it requires us to let go. But sometimes it says we can't let go. Because if I do that, my family, my partner, somebody is going to suffer. So this is so complex, you know. And so, again, the fact that you've been struggling with it for a long while is that's it. I don't know how we do this without struggling to some extent. Um, but then we let go of that. Right? We can't carry this around every minute of the day, every choice we make, everything we do. So again, compromise.
So there's an expression that is coming up for me, which is soft heart, which is that in the midst of all this, the Zen, the Zen razor is sharp, but at the same time, only don't know is very important, and humility is important, and soft heart is the humility to know that ultimately it's kind of a surrender is important as well, not just the sharp Occam's razor, not just the sense that you actually have to figure it out.
Yeah, thank you. One of the things that I think is often true is that there are many Zen people who are not happy, in part because they don't allow themselves, the joy. Cal mentioned joy, you know, that has an important place in our lives. It's an important thing that we can share with others. We can share in their joy. We can share our joy with them, all of those sorts of things. And that idea that we need to extend kindness and compassion to ourselves, not just to those around us. And we can allow ourselves to be happy. We can allow ourselves to feel joy. So the other side of this is we don't want to be so, have that discernment so deeply ingrained in us that we're just constantly looking, is this an attachment, is this a delusion, and unable to experience compassion for ourselves and joy in our lives. Now those might be messy things, but that's okay. Life is messy sometimes. And again, I think in Zen we tend to err towards the side of not being joyful, of not being, and so back to balance. I don't know that balance is necessarily a Buddhist idea, but I think it's an important idea.
Um, Peter, when you brought up the subject of attachment, I always kind of go to, yes, but what about grieving? Where does that fit in? And I think you did address that there's an appropriate time. And again, that would be balance, how you lose your house and you're not just going to say, oh, well, there has to be a certain amount of grieving, and I guess that time depends on us. But I do think that it's a paradox of Zen that on the one hand, we don't want we want to let go of suffering, and our practice is to uh, let go of suffering, not suffer. And yet we also um, are perhaps going to experience pain of loss, even more deeply because of our practice. And that always seems to be a difficult balance for me to find. Um, okay, I'm experiencing this pain. Let it go, and let it go, and let it go, and it's back, and it's back, um, and well, maybe that's because of my practice, and I need to feel that pain, but then I need to let go of that. Uh, so I know there's no answer. I know
Yeah, but
it's
there's a
it's all
partial answer.
balance, but
There's an answer to what you just said. feeling the pain is not attaching to the pain. Okay. And there absolutely are appropriate times to grieve, to feel pain, to feel sadness. But then, I mean, depending on the situation, you know what I mean? If we just lost a parent, we're going to grieve deeply for a long time. That's appropriate. If my car got messed up in an accident, I'm going to grieve for a couple of hours, and then I should be able to move past it, right? So again, depending on the type of grief, the depth of it, but it's absolutely appropriate, and it's not attachment. If we're clinging to it, I've told that story about the client I was seeing at one time who told me how upset she was that her mother died, and I said, "Oh, that's terrible. When did your mother die?" And she said, 10 years ago. Okay, that's attachment, right? She did not, and why? Because she never grieved. She didn't allow herself to really feel the sadness, to shed the tears. And so years later, it's still kind of floating there, disrupting her life. Um, you know, but so I think, again, grief is absolutely appropriate. Sadness, appropriate. That is not attachment. If we're clinging, maybe that's another word we should introduce here. An important word is clinging. If I'm not able to let it go after whatever is sort of an appropriate time. And again, there's no, but again, we lose a loved one, we lose a life partner. That's going to last, a grief that's going to last a lot longer than, even the house burning down, right? Each thing has got, a certain appropriateness to it. And allowing that is not being attached.
So it's always weighing what's going on in your head, I guess.
Well, it can, yeah, it can be. I mean, I think, again, we can make these distinctions ourselves. We can go to a therapist and say, "Hey, it's been 6 months. Why do I still feel this way?" And the therapist might say, "Oh, that's perfectly appropriate. Don't worry about it. Just go on living and you'll get through this." We don't know. So, certainly there's also times for that. There's times that we get help or support, or we ask the question because we don't always have the answers.
Mm. Thank you. And one other comment about joy. This morning I saw in the New York Times there was an article. What are the, I don't know, 7 or 8 books that therapists, self-help books that therapists should read or like to read, something like that. And the number 1 was a book about joy by the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu. So, Robert, I don't know if you've got that on your bookshelf, but I thought that was kind of interesting.
No, actually, I don't read self-help books. I find them boring and it puts me off reading. So to read, I read fiction, but I have plenty of patients or clients or whatever who will ask me for recommendations or will say like, "Oh, have you read that book?" And I'll usually say, "Oh, yeah, it's a good one," but I haven't.
But if you've ever seen the videos of the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu together, those two men understood joy at a depth that most of us don't. When they laughed, when they shared good times together, it was like, the deepest, most wonderfully felt laughter. If there's such a thing as pure laughter, and again, why? Because that on that side, they weren't obstructing, they weren't holding back. They allowed themselves the joy, just as I assume they allowed themselves the tears. They allowed themselves to plunge into the depths of life, whatever that depth was holding for them. And that, by the way, is freedom. When as Buddhists we talk about freedom, that's freedom. The freedom to laugh, the freedom to cry, right? To be able to fully and deeply experience our lives, whatever it is. Gary, where's the Sewell koan live? What book is that in?
It's in a book by Seng San. Um, but there's also in the book about women koans or something about women in Zen. There's also a much shorter version of it.
Oh, the 100 koans about women, which is I forget what it's called.
The Hidden
Yeah,
Lamp?
That collection.
I
The
think
Hidden
that's
Lamp?
what, yeah, yeah.
Um,
The one in the Seng San's book is much sort of fuller. Um, but yeah, I'll just mention, since you brought it up, so it's about uh, this Zen master who is also a grandmother, and her granddaughter dies, and she's uh, weeping and crying, and her family has asked, what you're supposed to be a famous Zen master. Why are you obstructed by this? And she says, "Don't you understand? My tears are more important than all the sutras and all the teachings and all the chanting." And and so I think that goes with what Peter's saying. I have a thought about it, that it seems like, when it's just the way we are as humans, as social animals, that if when we have close relationships, they sort of become sort of built into our brains, and wired into our brains, the presence of the other person. And then when they're just gone, it takes time for the brain to sort of rewire itself so it knows how to uh, live again in a different way that doesn't include this person being there all the time. And that I sort of imagine that that's grieving, that the process of rewiring the brain to so you can go on. And whereas if you're having this thing that's based on thought patterns, just instead of this deep wiring in your brain, just sort of ideas about the person that you need, and 10 years later, you still have those same ideas, that I sort of feel like maybe the distinction is between this sort of deep wiring in the brain versus patterns of ideas that you can keep on circling through. Just a
Thank you. If there were a simple source, I would assign that koan to everybody that's doing koans this week, but I don't know how
Well,
accessible.
I could post it
Oh,
above.
there. Okay. Y'all that are doing koans, koan for this week is Sewell. Gary will post it. That's great. Thank you, Gary.
I remember reading some time ago, this is on the heels of what Gary has just said, something that Carl Menninger said, and I think I may have even said it in this a year ago in this group, that he found that people who lived with great passion and openness toward another human being with love tended to recoup faster when they had a loss than those who didn't.
Well, that makes absolute sense. That's that kind of principle of the way to grieve is to grieve, to go through it, to feel the feelings, to shed the tears, and then the healing begins. But if you don't do that, you're like my woman who's 10 years later is still unresolved in her grief, you know. So the person who's open-hearted, who experiences their own emotions, can move through and heal. But if we block, we try not to feel it, then it festers. You know, I think that Wohl koan is wonderful, and yes, we will work on it this week. Oh, Thursday, people, you don't have dice on this week. Well, maybe you should be so unattached to Thanksgiving dinner that you're willing to meet with me on Thanksgiving, but I'm not, so tough. But anyway, so you'll do that koan next week. It'll be a 2-week koan. Never forget there's a little interruption coming up this week. You know, and another just kind of quick thought here is that to some extent our Buddhist ancestors didn't talk about these things in the same way that we do because they didn't live in the world that we do. They didn't have their families. They left their families behind. They didn't have to deal with partners and children and grandparents and blah, blah, blah. It wasn't part of their existence. They didn't have jobs. They didn't have to deal with colleagues and employers and so on and so forth. They didn't have intimate relationships if they were obeying the rules. I'm sure they didn't always obey the rules, but they didn't have people they were close to and loved. Quite the opposite. They shed most of those sorts they shed those attachments, and they saw that as desirable. We would, I think, see it as sociopathy if we shed all those things and we didn't experience the emotions that come out of being connected to other human beings. And, you know. So in a sense, we're really refiguring out Buddhism. We're really refiguring out Zen in a different culture, in a different age, and some of the lessons from our ancestors apply, and some do not, or at least have to be modified to live in this world today. Very challenging, you know, constantly. You know, we as Zen practitioners, we should always be on quicksand or a quaking bog. Anybody ever walk on a quaking bog? You're not allowed to anymore. They're protected, but and it's a good thing. But 50 years ago, when I was studying forestry, nobody thought about that. So we all went tromping out on a quaking bog to have an experience of what that was like. Well, the bog is like 3 feet of water with this sphagnum moss mat on top of it. And sometimes it supports you and sometimes it doesn't, but it's always moving like that. It's always moving, right? And that's what our practice is. We're walking on the sphagnum bog all the time. Okay. So please don't get so attached to the Sewell koan this week that you skip Thanksgiving dinner. It's perfectly all right to do both. Any thoughts or questions before we close? I mean, in a way, this is a topic that's inexhaustible, right? It's the one of the foundations of our practice and training, and we'll never have the answers. It's the sphagnum bog, and that's okay. Good. All right. Anything in the announcements, Susan or RJ? Are there any things that I should or that you should mention today? No. Okay.
I don't think so.
Okay. Yeah. So we're continuing to look at this retreat situation. The process is ongoing for the in-person retreat, but I think, am I safe saying that the dates are firm? Maybe I'm not safe saying it. If it ended up, for example, that we wanted to use this place on Cobbessy Lake, the Pilgrim Lodge, they would want us there a week earlier. Now, we moved that late in October to avoid higher prices. But in some places, a week earlier isn't going to mean a higher price. It's going to mean an opportunity to be there. So she said she'd be back to me early in December. Are we okay kind of leaving this a little tentative for a few more weeks? I was particularly looking at those of you who are going to need to arrange for airfares and things. Yeah, okay.
It seemed to me that if we can nail it down by January, does that give enough time for those who need to make advanced plans to know which week in October? So let's make that our goal, to nail it down before the end of the year.
Reasonable.
Yeah.
Sounds very reasonable. Good. Okay.
Creations are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to put an end to them. Reality is boundless. I vow to perceive it. The enlightened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. Creations are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to put an end to them. Reality is boundless. I vow to perceive it. The enlightened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. Creations are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to put an end to them. Reality is boundless. I vow to perceive it. The enlightened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it.
One closing story that came up for me about about the subject of retreats. Deborah, were you at the session where Steph invited the bird watchers? No. Okay. Well, anyway, so Steph just liked to mix things up occasionally and keep us off balance. And somehow there were what coincided with one of our retreats that there was a group of about 60 bird watchers. I don't know if they connected with Audubon or who that were in that Orono area to see certain species they were trying to see. So Steph invited them in for the evening to join our retreat. Except we had to stop our retreat. We had to entertain all these people, and then go back into the retreat. That that kind of by how he kept us from being attached to purity, and also to learn to move quickly from one sort of environment to the other. It was like, okay, these people are here for an hour, and then right back in, and then we sat the rest of the retreat. So he had a puckish nature, I would say. Is that fair, Deborah? Yeah. She's smiling good. Okay. Everybody have a good day. Enjoy.